Well, greetings, everybody, and welcome to another installment of City Lights Live, the online edition of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and as always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. It is always a privilege and an honor to do so. Tonight's event is called From Bohemians to Beans, Jack Kerouac and the Rise of the Haight. We'll be joined tonight by two great historians of counterculture as they connect the threads that bring literature, consciousness expansion, and social uprising together in an expansive view of the social experiments of the last century. We're happy to have with us Dennis McNally in conversation with Charles Shuttleworth. We are celebrating the publication of two new books: The Last Great Dream, How Bohemians Became Hippies and Created the Sixties by Dennis McNally, published by Capo Press, and Jack Kerouac, The Buddhist Years, edited by Charles Shuttleworth, published by Rare Bird Books and Sal Paradise Press. Dennis McNally is no stranger to City Lights. We've had the great pleasure of hosting him in the past. He is a New York Times bestselling author, historian, lecturer, and music industry professional. He's the author of Desolate Angel, Jack Kerouac, The Beat Generation, and America, as well as numerous other books. He's served as the first archivist for Bill Graham Presents, and having been selected as Grateful Dead's authorized biographer, he became the band's publicist, touring with the band, and is the recipient of ASCAP's Deems Taylor Virgil Thomson Award. Charles Shuttleworth is senior editor of Sal Paradise Press. He has edited 3 volumes of writings from the Kerouac archive, including Desolation Peak and Self-Portrait, co-edited with Paul Mayer, Jr. He has been teaching classes on Jack Kerouac and the Beat Generation for over the past 30 years, currently at Harker School in San Jose, California. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Dennis McNally and Charles Shuttleworth. It is a pleasure having you both with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah. Peter. That's a great start.
We always get confused. It's a Peter, Paul, and
and somebody. I guess I'm going to lead off and say that I've known Charles for Lord knows how long. When he invited me to talk to his students at the Beat Museum on Broadway here in San Francisco, and I did it at least 3 or 4 times, and I might add that I don't know where they come from, how it can be, but here are these wonderful students who were very smart and very curious about the beats. And I'm high school students, and so I was intrigued and have gotten to know Charles ever since. So when this idea came up, I thought it was, a perfect joining. Let me just say very briefly, obviously, my first book was about Kerouac, and so I have some familiarity with the Beat mythology and everything else. Then I did a book about the Grateful Dead and worked with them, and then I did a book about the background. And finally, in 2016, I was asked by the California Historical Society to curate a photo show leading to the Summer of Love. This was in 2016. Obviously, the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love was 2017, and every institution in the Bay Area was, quite hyped about it. And it was great fun. It was a treasure hunt, and I got involved with that deeply. After a while, it dawned on me that it was a book, and further still after a while, it dawned on me that it was sort of the rounding off of what I didn't realize at the beginning was my attempt to be the historian of the broader historian of the counterculture, particularly in America since World War II, of which, of course, Jack Kerouac is and of course he's in this new book, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. But the new book, obviously, the beats are a fundamental presence, and Buddhism, I might add. So it's very convenient that that's what Charles just published. So Charles, why don't you jump in?
All right. Well, first of all, I got to say that Desolate Angel was a really important book of mine, written by Dennis, but it really got me going on Kerouac. I think I'd read him before that, but and The Subterraneans was my favorite at the time. I do remember that, but when I read Desolate Angel, the great thing about that biography is how it puts it in a context, political, social context, historical context, which really helps my students. So we begin the class every year with reading Dennis, and then the fact that I was teaching in San Jose and he's in San Francisco made it possible for him to come and meet my students, and that's just been phenomenal for them and great experience. And the Beat Museum's been the perfect place to meet. So it's really been great. And then I just want to talk a little bit about Dennis's book. I mean, well, first of all, just to correct you, Dennis, a little bit, you were saying that your life thing became the broader story of the counterculture, but it was always a bit of your idea because you were saying that Kerouac was part one, and then you went to the Grateful Dead wanting to do part two. So, but this is a real rounding out, and it's a fantastically researched. If you look at the back of the book, he's got 61 listed interviews. It's a 36-page bibliography. And, to me, it's a serious look at the intellectual and cultural roots of the Haight-Ashbury scene as sort of the epicenter. But it also includes what was happening in New York and Los Angeles and London, and really tells the picture, the whole story, both, kind of politically and socially. So I think it's a fantastic book, and it's going to be a lot of fun to talk about.
Well, thank you. I'm gonna have to, I'm an inveterate interrupter of myself and storyteller, and I'm just going to jump in very briefly because you mentioned the subterraneans, and it actually connects very directly with Kerouac and Buddhism, and that is the central woman character in the subterraneans is a woman named Mardu Fox. Um, she was in the early this is so far back, I can't even remember. The early 70s, she was married to a man named Lucien Carr. I interviewed Lucien. It was my first big interview. And uh, contrary to my instructions, because he was known as someone who, in the tradition of newspaper editors, was a drunk. And we proceeded to get thoroughly high. And then on the way to his place, he said, "By the way, you don't have to admit it, but of course, the woman you're going to meet now, my wife, is Mardu Fox." And I just about, my jaw dropped off the cab floor. Uh, and of course, as you know, and as probably most of our audience knows, um, after he broke up with Mardu, Kerouac was down, post romance depression, and he came across. I think thanks to Alan, he came across, as I am told, and of course I might add, by the way, and I'll mea culpa right now. My prime research on Kerouac was 50 years ago. I am getting old, and the fact is, so if I get things fuzzy, feel free to correct me, and don't feel that I'm going to get sensitive because I've got a great excuse. Um, and supposedly, thanks to Alan, he read a biography of the Buddha by Ashvaghosha, and in it there was a line, "Repose beyond fate," which is what Buddhism ultimately, is about. I speak as a practicing Buddhist, and it took him into 2 years in particular of serious study. Most people agree that he kind of adapted his reading in Buddhism to his childhood Roman Catholicism, um, but uh, it's eminently worth paying attention to. Let's put it that way. I might also add that, by the way, that when I did my book, and that's the commentary on how long this has all been. I I teased Holly George Warren, who is now the official biographer, thanks to the estate, and has access to things that I never did. And I was teasing her that she had that access and so forth. And she looked at me, she said, "Yeah, but you got to meet all those people when they were still alive 50 years ago." And that's true too. At any rate, Charles, let's talk about Kerouac and Buddhism, because he was quite, whatever one thinks of as a purist Buddhist, he was quite serious about his study.
Right. Well, yeah, it came right, and this comes up in the Buddhist years. He tells the story in two different ways, two different versions, but it's essentially the same. He was heartbroken over the breakup with Aileen Lee, and suicidal, he says, and was seeking solace. And you're right that Alan was very likely a part of the trigger, because Alan was investigating Buddhism himself, actually Zen Buddhism more than anything. Earlier that year, he was going to the New York Public Library to look at Chinese paintings, and then he got drawn into Zen, and he was talking about the koans, which Kerouac was kind of turned off by, because one of the koans is about chopping a cat in half, and Kerouac is a great cat lover. So he really didn't go for that. So in the two stories in the Buddhist years, he doesn't mention Alan, doesn't give him credit. He says he went to the library and he found the Ashvagoda book. And it's a story of Buddha, and I think that it gave him a lot of solace because he saw himself in Buddha a little bit in the renunciation of home and family. For Kerouac, it was a renunciation of work, right? He just wasn't willing to hold a job down, and it gave him the freedom to pursue what he wanted to pursue, which was writing. Period. That's what he lived for. So he basically renounced all other responsibility. So it's probably important to say that Kerouac was, autodidact with it. He was a self-studier. He did not go seeking expert advice about it, or expert knowledge. He did it all himself, but he read very deeply. He took it very seriously, and it's very evident in both the Buddhist years, which I think is more accessible, but some of the Dharma is a great work. To see his actual, essentially what he did was he typed up his diaries, his notes on Buddhism, and some of the Dharma I think is a great work. And just another thing to mention is he always gets uh, uh, dismissed or denigrated for, Capote said that it's not writing, it's typing. Whenever he typed, his handwritten work, and most of it was done because of his poverty by hand. It's another level of artistry. He didn't simply type; he picked and chose, and he rearranged, and that's been one of the things that has been, I think, important to discover. But in any case, very serious about Buddhism, and it did give him a lot of solace, right up until the point when he climbed Desolation Peak, seeking enlightenment, and didn't find it. Basically because he was about the last person who could stand being alone for 2 months. There was a definite decline after that in his interest and certainly in his study. Really, the culmination of his Buddhism is the scripture of the Golden Eternity, which he wrote right before he went up there. So he wrote that in April, May, and then was up on the mountain in July, August, and that pretty much, you know, from then it starts to wane. So.
Well, and if I recall correctly, and you feel free to correct me, but if I recall correctly, not so long thereafter, I think that was 55.
56.
56. Well, and what happened? Well, shortly thereafter, Malcolm Cowley got him the prize, except of course it was the bombshell, and it was You said something about, nobody was ready to be alone for 2 months. Nobody could be less capable of being alone. Well, nobody could be less capable of being famous.
Right.
The definition of fame is when people think they know who you are, and you don't know them. And so, there he was suddenly, thanks to Gilbert Milstein and the Marvelous Review, suddenly he's famous. On the Road comes out, and he's hasn't got a clue how to handle that kind of fame. He gets the Dharma Bums out, which is kind of a last, as you say, it waned, and really it's more about Gary to me, it's more about Gary than Buddhism per se. But it honors what he had been studying. And he did some other, a lot of other, including Big Sur, which is great. But in general, my comment is that the only thing he really could do after fame was to drink and wrap himself in a liquid shield of armor and cope with fame and money, and family members wanting to borrow, and all the complications particularly sudden fame. He simply wasn't ready for it. I don't think very many people are, but certainly not Jack. Let me turn this around and just give a little background on The Last Great Dream and where Jack fits into my book, which goes a little further, chronologically. And that is, as I say, I started this as a reaction to the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love. And when they hired me, I said, by the way, you realize that the Summer of Love was not the summer of 1967. It was the fall of 1966, before the publicity. And when, oh, by the way, the weather's better in San Francisco than it actually is in the summertime. As I look out on San Francisco in the cold fog, God, it's been a cold summer. And the first image I had very quickly was there was a guy named Harry Radel, R-E-D-L, who was a wonderful photographer, and he made an early version early version of Photoshop, which was a photo that melded two pictures, one of the Sir Francis Drake Hotel, which is this building in the fall of 54. Alan went to his girlfriend's apartment on Nob Hill and took peyote. And the foggy mist of San Francisco, he looked down on Sir Francis Drake, and there are these two odd windows, which I don't think are actually used as windows. They're there. They look like eyes, and at least if you're doing enough peyote. And he decided that this was Moloch, the brain, the soul eater of Hebrew mythology, and that is where it stood or sat for about 6 months. And then in the summer, I think, sometime earlier in 55, later than that, in 55, he sat down at a typewriter and started writing. And we all know the famous opening lines of Howl. And that was the sort of, that's where I started. But then I realized that, and it's very important to recognize that there was a very thriving poetry scene in San Francisco long before Alan got there. And of course, that led to some hard feelings because it's my comment that beat became such a catchphrase with the media because it was such a perfect brand. It was short, it was sweet, and as soon as you heard beat, you knew, beat, and then later beatnik, you had a picture, and the media could use it very conveniently, and frankly not take it very seriously. And as a result, uh, they got eclipsed. The other poets got eclipsed. But as I started thinking about it as a book, I started with the guy who really drove, not as a great poet necessarily, but as a good and important teacher, Kenneth Rexroth, and whose anarchism was frankly even more important to me than any other aspect of his oeuvre as a poet. And Robert Duncan, who sort of threw in the mystical element. So the two of them to get met in 1942, and that's sort of where my story goes. And then as the 40s passed, that message percolated amongst the students at what was going to become the Art Institute. It was a different name that week, that year. And the result was a group of people. One of them was, for instance, a man named Mel Weitzman, who later became the abbot of the Zen Center. Not all Bohemians, carouse and drink wine. Some of them, they all figure out ways to leave the conventional society behind, but there are different ways, and Mel certainly had his, which was Zen. But before that, he had been a trumpet playing, I imagine pot smoking. Certainly he drank some. Denizen of North Beach. So was Wally Hedrick, who was a artist, very serious beat artist. And I'm going to tell one story, which in some ways is the whole of my book, or it sums it up in a lot of ways, and then stop for a second, give Charles a chance. And that is that Wally taught students in what they called Saturday art, high school students. And one of them was a young man from the Mission by the name of Jerry Garcia. And he played, Wally played black folk music, like Big Bill Brunzi, while they painted, not uncommon. And it resulted in Jerry Garcia, when shortly thereafter his mother gave him an accordion for a birthday present, he cried and pissed and moaned and said, no, 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 it has to be a guitar, which basically defined the rest of his life. But in addition, he and his buddy who were taking the class asked, what is this beat thing? Because of course it was in the papers, and it was current events. And Wally said, your beat, go to City Lights, get this book On the Road, which of course was on the bestseller list at that time, and read it. And it became Jerry's Bible. And the long and the short of it is, eventually I met him and mentioned the Kerouac book, oh so subtly. And eventually he said, why don't you do us? And that is where I had been by that point I was a deadhead. And I saw the connections, the most obvious being Neal Cassady as Dean Moriarty, and Neal Cassady who was part of the Kesey scene and therefore part of the Grateful Dead scene in the early days. And the rest is history. And I think that's enough about my book.
Okay, well, what I still want to get to your book though. So one of the things that I wanted to just connect was kind of Kerouac and the Beats with the hippies. And so the Beats, it seems to me, I think you may have used the word forerunner, but not progenitor, because it predates the Beats. Obviously, it's the whole history of Bohemianism. Thoreau is mentioned in your book. There's also the Diggers, who are very important in your book, and they name themselves after English dissidents, from the 1650s, egalitarian nonconformist. So, but with one difference that I saw was that with Kerouac's original group, New York, it was a small group of friends, and yet the hippies created a whole community. And what you mention is that the connection between the two is that the essential value is anarchism, which is, again, it sounds like a dirty word to a lot of us, but really it's just, a theory of abolition of hierarchical government and organization on a voluntary cooperative basis. And, they just, the Beats, the original kind of Ginsberg, Kerouac, Burroughs gang, Lucian Carr, they were looking for what they called the new vision. You call them cultural critics. And they were looking to essentially alienated from mainstream society and looking for ways to escape it. And so Arthur Rimbaud was an important poet that they read about who was arguing for the systematic derangement of the senses, right, to break free of the conventional ways of perception. And ultimately, so they had the same idea as the hippies. The hippies had different drugs.
And more convenient drugs. And the one of the differences, at least, is granted, the hippies, there were exceptions, the Diggers being one of them. Peter Berg was a very well-read man. But most of the hippie scene was not so consciously intellectual, and it was even more, not that the Beats, that original group of Beats didn't, do drugs and experience and learn a lot from that experience. And the general, as you say, derangement of the senses. But the hippie scene was more sort of large group, rock and roll versus jazz, and color versus kind of black and white. But you mentioned Thoreau, and I just want to go back and part of every one of my lectures, and this is what I got into in my book on Highway 61, which is simply America has always run around saying that, we're the land of freedom, and freedom is what America is all about. But, for what it's worth, there are at least two kinds. This is a little bit reductionist, but there are two kinds of freedom. There's the freedom to make as much money as humanly possible, which obviously the current administration is, a shining representative of. And then there's the intellectual freedom, the freedom to deconstruct all of the elements of the American identity, which starts with at least vague Christianity most of the time. Again, capitalism, all the idea that nature is there to be exploited, and all of that is what Thoreau systematically dismissed. And I just, outside of the fact that he's my hero, the fact is simply, when you think about a man in the 1850s, almost literally, just dismissing almost the entirety of the cultural construct that was his world, and among other things, doing that because of slavery and because of his opposition to slavery and the fact that he was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, the entire civil rights movement of Massachusetts, the central, from all accounts, one of the central nodes of that entire activity was his his mother and sister's dinner table, because they were important abolitionists. So anyway, that's the freedom that obviously that I like to think about and that I think is important, and it drifts through American culture throughout, and you get to Kerouac and the Beats, who are doing basically the same thing as the transcendentalists, which is trying to find a more authentic self and a more gracious way of living in this world, and a way that's much more interested in art and love and so forth, and not gaining. And that's why he could turn to Buddhism. As I said, I just for what it's worth, I practice Zen, and I constantly sort of run over the kind of general things that Buddhists believe in, that among other things, making money is not the goal of life. And then I look at our president and reflect that if I tried to run a Buddhist rap on him, he would be looking at me like, "You're crazy. You're just simply crazy. What you're saying is, makes no sense to me," which, I understand. obviously what he says doesn't make any sense to me either.
Okay. Uh, okay, so I want to tie two things together. One is, again, your book is so great in showing all of the elements that led up to essentially the Haight, which was, the heyday, the height of, the hippie movement. You end it early, but with the highlight with Monterey Pop, and the be-in being essentially the turning point in a negative way because it brought publicity to the scene, and so then there was this onslaught of young teenagers rushing to San Francisco to join in, and there was even the song encouraging them to do it. So there's so many things I want to talk about, but let's start with the fact that the Haight. There's one line in your book where it says it's a coming together of forces, the politics of struggle versus the politics of consciousness. So, and again, you do such a great job in tracing all of the politics of struggle, going back really, well, McCarthyism, I guess, is early, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and then the reactions to that, SDS, the civil rights movement, the Freedom Riders, then 30 of them came back and started the Berkeley free speech movement. So there's just all this material, and they're fighting against all these forces. The Beats were fighting against the, kind of the new critics and the social critics like Norman Podhoretz. There was all this opposition. And then there's the politics of consciousness, which really, LSD was just a very convenient. You mentioned that it's stronger than other hallucinogens, which had an effect, but also it could be manufactured to a huge scale and transported pretty easily too. So again, it just sort of was a combination of these two things, um, and so I don't know if you want to talk about. I mean, it's all in your book about just the importance of LSD on the scene because again, it awoke people. And just to go back to the Beats, they were talking about the derangement of the senses, but they were doing it with benzodrine and alcohol and morphine, and the hallucinogens are just much more thoughtful drugs, right?
Leary showed up and gave Alan, I think it was psilocybin at first, and said, give it away. And Alan took it to Thelonious Monk, who said, "You got anything stronger?" Dizzy Gillespie said, "Oh, that was nice," and a couple of other people, that were in the scene. Reacted less well. The point, I think the major point was you. What the book is about is the art, the avant-garde artists of the 50s, and there's electronic music, and there's theater, and there's dance, there's all kinds of different things. And the scene sort of flees North Beach, the beat scene of North Beach, because there are tourists and prices are, rents go up and so forth and so on. And long story short, they end up in the Haight, which conveniently was exceptionally inexpensive for the simple reason that the state, or pardon me, the federal government was going to run a freeway up the street that leads into the Golden Gate Park, and then across Golden Gate, a 6-lane freeway across Golden Gate Park, so that you could get through San Francisco quickly to get to the Golden Gate Bridge. I shudder to think. But at any rate, obviously, eventually, the people of the Haight and a wonderful woman by the name of Sue Bierman, and her husband, she later became a supervisor, said, "No, we're not having it," and stopped it. And so suddenly, all these incredibly inexpensive apartments were now available for young people to come to. And they did. And businesses opened up on Haight Street that were related to the students who were there, among other things, because there was a streetcar down to where San Francisco State is to this day, down in the Sunset. But they lived in the Haight because it was way cheaper than the Sunset. So, it's all going very swimmingly. And 1966, you have this extraordinary social experimentation under the influence of LSD in regard to things like materialism and sexuality, things like the whole idea of the gentle male hippie, which was central to what was going on, which would lead, I would argue, to gay liberation. It's no coincidence that the next generation, that is the 70s, saw this influx of gay refugees from Middle America into the Castro, among other things, among other places, and on and on and on. One of the things that I tell the students that I work with, not only at Charles's school, but also there's one in Monte Diablo, that the reason that when we're talking about the 60s with these students, I'm pointing out that these events took place 50 years before they were born. Why are they interested? They're interested because none of these issues have gone away. The impact of the Haight was not just about, well, it failed at politics, except maybe helping end the war. But it affected the culture, so that if you eat organic food, if you practice yoga, if you are concerned about the environment, if you have a personal computer, there's a wonderful book about how the psychedelics affected Silicon Valley. It's called, by the way, for those of you who don't know it, it's called What the Dormouse Said. It's by a guy named John Markoff, who covered Silicon Valley for the New York Times. And there's a reason why Silicon Valley became the home of computing rather than, say, near MIT, because these guys had tripped. And instead of having the giant computer, IBM that's a room-sized computer with little minion people scurrying around it, they went for something very different. So anyway, all this stuff had an impact, still does, very much so. And that's, I think, why music, there's still deadheads. And I've managed to go this entire conversation and not mention that aspect of my life. But there you go. Oh no, I did mention Jerry. But anyway, it is true that all this stuff is still part of our culture.
Okay. So one thing I want to do, two things real quick. One is I'm going to give myself a little plug. There's an article, essay that I wrote recently called Kerouac's Buddhism, When, Where, and Why, and it's on the Beatdom website. It clears up a lot of the there's a lot of misinformation about how he got into it. I just added to that by not mentioning Thoreau, because he specifically says he went to the library to look at Thoreau, and Thoreau mentioned the Hindus, and that kind of triggered him. He also knew about it, by the way, years earlier. He had a professor, what's his first name? Raymond Weaver at Columbia, who had taught in Japan and gave him a book list that included some of this. I'll just also read a really quick quote from Dharma Bums, just to point out that, again, what I was saying about, it started to fade after the experience on the mountaintop in 56. At the end of 57, after On the Road, and he started to really succumb to the pressures of publicity, he wrote Dharma Bums. And what he says in Dharma Bums, virtually on page 1, it might be page 2, here's the quote. He says, "I was very devout in those days and was practicing my religious devotions to perfection. Since then, I've become a little hypocritical about my lip service and a little tired and cynical because now I am grown so old and neutral. So again, he's admitting it. But what I wanted to do was really point out in your book, I think it's pretty clear, the connection between Buddhism and the psychedelic experience. And to really put that way, we've been talking about LSD a lot. There's a really important element that LSD contributes to what happened in essentially opening people's minds. And you have a quote where you say, this is a little bit of a paraphrase, where Western thought is crippled by the separation of mind from body and humans from nature, there's a Buddhist recognition of the interconnectedness of all beings and a non-theistic mode of contemplation that's valuable and a valuable and healing corrective. And with LSD, one of the things you say is that there was a universal reaction to the people who took it to see the world as one, as interconnected, as not just, uh, well, just as a Buddhist might. So, I mean, I do think that there's a clear connection there. It just, and, all of the quotes that come up, I could read the one by Ram Dass where he says, that with psychedelics, you can reprogram yourself and create a higher level of consciousness and see the world in terms of what the mystics and poets and Tibetans talked about. So it was kind of a shortcut. And of course, that's, I think, what the Dalai Lama said when Ginsberg offered him some LSD and he didn't do it. But Ginsberg talked about it widened the area of consciousness. You've got quotes by just blanking for a second. Oh, Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception, 1956. Huxley was talking about the inner and outer worlds, and that this lets you into the inner world. It gives you entree. But again, you can do it through Buddhist meditation as well and Buddhist study. But the drugs were kind of a shortcut.
And I completely agree. And I wanted to come back to that just to say one of the central moving items in all this mishmash that's happening in San Francisco and everywhere else was essentially the recognition. Um, we live in a time in which there's so much doubt since oh, I've forgotten the man's name, but about the Orientalism and the idea that so much of scholarship on Asian culture um, is suspect because for instance, the people in India in the 1800s who were first studying it as a fairly serious way, were crippled by the fact that they were faithful Christians and sort of disrespected what they were writing about, even though they were in some ways very impressed with it. Um, the fact is that it's essential, the message, which is, as I say, rejecting the basic mind-body discontinuity of Western society, and moving toward something that's much more Buddhist, that's basically recognizes that it's all one, we're all connected, and that it's our job to recognize that, and that is really what the Haight was, ultimately was about. That's why it's the last great dream. I say, I don't know about the last. Hopefully there'll be more, but it is a great dream in that it tries to bring, peace and a universal sense of peace and love um, to the world. It didn't work, or at least it didn't last very long. And as I say, it went so well in the fall of '66 that they decided to have a party, and they called it the Be-In. And unfortunately, 50,000 people showed up at the Be-In, and suddenly, and I might add that at the Be-In, the entire authority presence were 2 police on horses. That was the security for the event, which when you think about it now, well, just think about it. And as a result, suddenly, the media went bananas. And the problem is that the media did not recognize either in Kerouac and Ginsberg or the hippies the essentially spiritual nature of what was going on. And that's the tragedy. Let me finish with this one, great example. We're getting near the end. I don't know, Charles, where you want to go, but let me just say this one thing. There was a young man. He was a beat reporter. He was like a cub reporter for Newsweek. His name was Hendrik Hertzberg, and many of you will know that name as the very distinguished writer for The New Yorker. But in 1966, they sent him to San Francisco to research. And as you all, I'm sure, know, Time Newsweek, somebody researches and then somebody writes. And he went, and he was, as far as I can tell, the only reporter that did not take one look at the hippies and go, oh my God, these people are crazy and they've got these beads and they're just, they're ridiculous. I don't understand them at all. And he, for whatever reason, it just didn't bother him. And he wrote his notes, which he's since published, are very perceptive. Now, of course, the article, drop-kicked everything virtually everything he said, and produced the usual, fiddle faddle. I mean, it was just nonsense. But that was the problem, is simply that the media, not to pick on the media, particularly now when it's under such an onslaught, but the fact is the media, they were straight and they couldn't see the spiritual nature of what was going on. And that's where it all ended up in the ash heap.
Okay. Well, all right. So I want to get to questions. I'm hoping we will, but
Let's.
just to make a couple of extra points. One about my book, just about the
Please.
Buddhist years, because it really does show how serious and how spiritual Kerouac was. So I think that it really, for those of you who only know him through On the Road, it's pretty eye-opening. And again, I think it's pretty accessible also. I love some of the Dharma, but this is more storytelling, and so I like it. In terms of
So do I.
in terms of your book, there's so many pieces of it that more than we can talk of. But in terms of, just to mention again that all the things that led up to it, both politically and so many other factors that in American society from essentially the end of World War II up until it all happened. And Vietnam was another important event. The Vietnam protests, hippies joined in on those. You mentioned that. So it wasn't simply we've got the political side. The coming together, the gathering of the tribes was very much, in a way, that's what that was, right? That was kind of the Berkeley political side, and then the Haight spiritual side. Music is incredibly important in your book, and you were very thorough about that, about what's happening in all the different places. It does also cover New York City. There was an interesting dichotomy I didn't realize between the East Village hippies and the West Village kind of jazz and coffee group. So again, there are just so many elements that it's really rich, and it made me think about, obviously Dylan is a central person. You wrote the Highway 61 book, and along with that, the whole folk revival. There was, I don't know if I particularly put this together until I was reading your book, but just the fact that, if you're suddenly listening to Appalachian mountain music, if you're listening to black music, which essentially was, segregated at the time, people were suddenly empathizing right, with the downtrodden, and see, and not it's a change of, it's anti-materialism, and and a sense of, it was a whole movement toward what ultimately kind of culminated with the Haight, and kind of went on from there. Um, I'm good.
I'm
Oh,
good. And
one last thing, just about the be-in, you mentioned, and this kind of ties it together a little bit. You said it was really
absolutely.
important that the people on stage were the beats, right? Ginsberg was there, McClure, Gary Snyder, and just to point out that what you say is that it was important to have the recognition of the Haight's roots in beat poetry. McClure, who's, you called it biologically based mysticism, with Gary Snyder, his connection to Native Americans and to Buddhism, and Ginsberg being sort of the more political. But they were there, and they were the, again, the forerunners, um, uh, as this whole thing culminated and then fairly quickly fell apart.
Thank you. And yeah, no, that had crossed my mind to say, and then so thank you for getting us that.
Oh,
Uh,
and here's one thing. Well, the last thing you should talk about, Dennis, is just let me see how I phrased it. The impact. Okay, so the lasting impact of the hippie movement. I don't think we've particularly covered that.
well, as I say, it's mostly cultural. It's about lifestyle. It's about things like, as I say, organic food and yoga and you name it. It's about a way of a kind of a Buddhistic way of looking at the world. And this stuff all connects, and there are a whole lot of threads to it. And there you go. And now I'm going to call on our kind host, Brother Maravellis, to throw us some questions. Sorry, we went late, Peter. I hope.
Not a problem. We've been enjoying this. So Julian asks, in any of their works, have Dennis or Charles ever stumbled upon a seemingly mundane detail that, upon deeper research, revealed a far greater significance or unexpected story?
I mean, I feel like there's one on every page for Dennis's book. I mean, it was all, again, there's so many elements. And there are things that I know nothing about that, like, Dennis did the same thing for me with Desolate Angel, the Kerouac biography. It gave me a lifelong reading list, because he mentioned all the things that Kerouac read, and suddenly I wanted to go read it all. Dostoevsky probably being number one, but I mean, it was everything. And then all the jazz. I had to go, I took all these notes and I started listening to all the jazz. So the same thing's happening to me with the great Last Great Dream. One thing is the experimental music of John Cage, which I have no exposure to. But I also just bought. It's coming. I'll get it from Amazon tomorrow. Sorry about that. Using Amazon, but Emmett Grogan's Ring Alivio, and I'm going to listen on Audible to Peter Coyote's book. So I'm really intrigued by the Diggers, and it makes me want to dig deeper to know more.
The Diggers were important, just as their critique of materialism is as profound, and its impact on the environment. Berg was an environmentalist in 1966, and that's pretty unique in American culture at that point, post Rachel Carson. But so that's really important stuff. And uh, you know, again, that's one of the threads that still are truly important now.
So Joseph asks, was there any relationship between the Beats and the emerging existentialist movement in literature?
That's an interesting question. Charles, I mean, the Beats were in, of course, hung out for a while at the Beat
Mhm.
Hotel in Paris. Um, uh, And Alan was a networker before the phrase network was invented. But I'm not aware. Undoubtedly he sought out Sartre. I mean, he must have, but that's I don't know. So that's now there's a topic for a master's thesis. Charles, what do you know?
Well, I would just say that, I mean, to me, they're on the same wavelength. And so you mentioned as one of the important events at one point, waiting for Godot making it to the New York stage. I think of Sartre's work. I really relate to it, I think, for the same reasons. I think it's non-theistic, right? And so there's a really important connection there. Whether or not they were influenced by one another, it's hard to say. I haven't encountered anything in Kerouac where he's talking about either Camus or Sartre directly.
Not
But
that I'm aware
but
of.
again, they were sitting at the feet of William Burroughs, who was all over this stuff, and just the European thought. I think it was very important to them. Again, getting away from American exceptionalism and just the Protestant ethic, and they looked to Europe for it. And so the fact that the existential movement, it was pretty much the same time.
Well, I think what's significant too is if you remember during the 1968 Democratic Convention, William Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, and Jean Genet were hand in hand marching through the streets of Chicago. Right around that time, City Lights published a manifesto by Genet that was in solidarity with the Black Panther Party. So you had these threads that kind of traveled from Paris to Chicago at a very, very important time. Let's see, there's more questions coming through. Let's see. Joseph already asked a question. Nancy says, poets as forerunners, please expand on this. She mentioned Sartre and nausea. Let's see. Christopher says, I'm often telling my students that the 60s counterculture and hippies represented a revival of the 19th century romantic ideals, down to the permissive sexual attitudes, a longing for authenticity, a fascination with quote unquote the Orient, a willingness to experiment with substances. Do the beats themselves connect their work and ideas to romanticism? That's a deep rabbit hole.
Well, to romanticism, that's easy. Yes, William Blake was incredibly important to Ginsberg in particular. And Kerouac, over and over again, I find in his Buddhist writing, is connecting specifically with Wordsworth's ode, Intimations of Immortality, the sense that we come from a place of perfection and then we lose our memory of it and then we go back. And that was really part of his own spirituality. It's what he certainly hoped for. So yeah, they very much connected with the Romantics.
And transcendentalism is, an offshoot of romanticism on some level, in terms of, seeking very much Blake, seeking a higher consciousness and so forth and so on. So yeah, the answer is yes.
Right. Oh, and also I'll mention in Dennis's book, one phrase that really stuck out for me was he talked about the beats as a poetics of immanence, right? A spiritual platform in which poems come directly from the author, and the form is dictated by the poem itself. So it's a real freeing of poetic form. And again, it's very personal, which is romanticism. So.
James says, when in Brunswick, Maine, stop by Gulf of Maine Books, where the owner, Gary Lawless, with spouse, is a poet, musician, and community organizer and friend of Gary Snyder. Pancho says, existentialism was about having to make meaning in the world without having to depend on religion, family, and government. This is precisely what the beats were about. And then Nancy chimes in once again, mentioning Blake and Byron.
Mhm. Mhm.
And
Yeah.
we and don't forget Gregory Corso's obsession with Shelley. So
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there was Ezra Pound.
yeah. Oh, him.
Let's see. Pancho also says, Creeley, form is never more than an extension of content.
Good.
It should be.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we are finding ourselves here at the top of the hour. And I would like to see if you have any final thoughts before we wrap.
Well, I did want to add one remark, which um, Charles talked about me trigger with Desolate Angel triggering a reading list for him, and I wanted to say, yeah, well, that's what happened to me because when I started Kerouac, um, I later joked that I gave myself a master's. Remember, I'm a historian. I'm not a literature. I was not from the literature department, and that's if there's one thing that distinguishes my Kerouac book, it's not a literary approach. And but I read Dostoevsky and on Thomas Wolfe and just everything. Pretty much tried to read a good sampling of what he read because, you know, that's how you can't not do that if you're going to write a book about a literary person. Um, and so all this comes together. Uh, Charles, take the last word.
Oh, gee. Um, you know, buy Dennis's book.
Oh, I don't want
Charles's book, everyone, too.
to. And by Charles's book, there's a lot in there.
And we have posted links in the chat with which you may do that. I want to thank you both for gracing our halls. I mean, this has been a wonderful discussion, and congratulations for both of your books. And also want to thank all of you in the audience. You've been a really wonderful crowd, and thanks for all the questions and the enthusiasm. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our publishing program, and all our educational outreach. Of course, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So long, everyone. Take care. Be kind to each other, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Charles, thank you. Peter,
Okay.
thank you.
Right.
We'll do it again sometime.
Looking
Okay.
forward.
All right. Thanks.
Be well. Take care.
Cheers.